Welcome to the Middle-earth Philosopher, where I take a look at ideas, people, and relationships within Middle-earth and try to examine them from a philosophical point of view that people in that world may have held. For this particular episode, I want to go back into the first stage and look at the worldview of one particular Valar, the Valar named Ulmo. And the reason for this being that out of all of them, next to Morgoth, he seems to be the most standout, the most unique, the most who is involved and active within the affairs of Middle-earth than the rest of his kind. And I want to look at why is that? Not necessarily, what he did per se, but why he did it. Now, as everybody knows, Ulmo was considered the Lord of Waters over all of Arda and Middle-earth during the First Age. He was there from the beginning, from before it was created, like the rest of his kind, after it was created, and when the first wars had started with Morgoth, after he had pretty much destroyed the original paradise of Almarin. And again, as everybody knows, from that point on the larger scene, Valinor is then created from the leftovers and remnants of that, and is made into the Holy West of the Valar, who then decided to live separately from the rest of Middle-earth that was either healing or was just so scarred that for a long time they didn't have anything to do with it. And I think it's from this point that Ulmo begins to stand out as a character. And by that, I mean that we start to see more agency than the rest of his kind, with the exception of Morgoth. And just as a side note here, just for convenience sake, I'm going to refer to Melkor as Morgoth, since that's the most popular name that he's known by. So bear with me on that. From the creation of Valinor, Ulmo seems to almost separate himself from the rest of his peers. It's said that he spends little to no time in Valinor, like the rest of his people, and that he spends the majority of his time in the seas and the oceans doing, before the wars begin and everything, who knows what. But by and large, he seems to have little to nothing to do with the rest of them. And I think a lot of this stems from what happened in Almarin and what happened immediately afterwards. And this is where we start to see his philosophy. So my theory on his philosophy is this, that the downfall of Almarin, I think, scarred Ulmo, in the sense that it made him more pragmatic. Not cynical, but much more pragmatic. It is said that when Almarin fell, that the Valar were resting on the main island that they and every other living being was supposed to inhabit, I guess, before Morgoth basically snuck in, destroyed the lamps, and then hid from the rest of the Valar, leaving them to basically clean up the mess that he had made. And for certain, Ulmo was a part of this cleanup and this kind of reshaping of the world, marred as it is at this point. And I think that did something to his outlook, in that the Valar needed to be much more present and much more aware of what was going on in Arda, because when they were not paying attention in resting and or partying or whatever it was that they were doing, that's when Morgoth snuck in and started just messing up everything. And from this sense, I think that he was much more aware and self-aware than the rest of them, with the possible exception of Mandos. And I think it's because of this particular reason that he is always in the waters of Middle-earth, that he wants to prevent something like this from happening again. He wants to not be caught sleeping, as it were. He's going to be the watchman on the wall for the Valar, basically. I think another impact on his philosophy is the migration of the first generation of elves to Valinor, because It's said that when the Valar become aware that the elves have been created, and they send one of their own out to basically scout them out and kind of confirm it, and when that is confirmed, along with some elven emissaries, that a great meeting is gathered between the Valar, maybe some Maiar as well, to determine, what they're going to do about this, because at this point, Middle-earth is still kind of a mess from the downfall of Almarin. They put most of their focus on Valinor. So everything that was going on in Middle-earth at this point, they pretty much had no clue, even though some of them did go into Middle-earth to either hunt or plant seeds for future restorations. By and large, they had nothing to do with it, so they were pretty much unaware of what was going on. That being said, they choose to go to war with Morgoth again, and end up wrecking a good portion of the northern part of Middle-earth as it existed at that point during the process of this war, and Ulmo was a part of that. And afterwards, that they had another meeting to decide what they're going to do about the elves, because the elves are pretty much again left over with this mess that they had made, even though it was made for good cause. And Ulmo stands out among many of them as being against bringing them over to Valinor for their own protection, because he believes that their purpose in Middle-earth was to enrich and to bless it, not to become segregated and isolated from it as the rest of his kind were doing at that point in time. And ultimately, of course, he's outvoted. But I think that stigma, if you will, still remained with him. It still stung to him. I think it's a situation that he remembers what happened with Almarin when the Valar were not paying attention. So he is not down with this, and from that point on, he doesn't forsake the rest of his kind, but he doesn't have a lot to do with them at that point. Again, with the exception of Mandos, I think Ulmo is all about the larger plans of the Iluvatar working themselves out in the world, and that's his main drive for what he's doing. However, I also think that it's also in part motivated by a sense of empathy, which is ironic given that he is said to be one of the most terrifying Valar to look at. Because every time someone sees him in the physical form, it's in this sense of great power, like you are in the presence of a god, which I guess if you were a mortal or even an elf at that point, they probably are gods to you, so there you are. Either way though, Ulmo's the one who basically is going to bat for the peoples of Middle-earth at this point. Even after the Noldor are exiled and are hounded by one of his servants, Ase, because they killed many Teleri in that process, Ulmo is still trying to help them out. He is trying to encourage them to follow the visions of a Iluvatar and letting them know to what is going to happen as far as he knows, and to be prepared for that, i.e. the creations of Nargothrond and Gondolin when he gives dreams to Finrod and Turgon. Also, too, he is the one who is actively participating in, yes, keeping the Noldor banned from Valinor when they tried to go back or send emissaries back, but also, too, that there was one point where he, before Eärendil eventually came over, he himself went over and said that they need to get involved because of the advantages that Morgoth was gaining, and that they needed to do this. And obviously Manwë said no, but again, I think this was motivated largely by his devotion to the plan, and again also too by empathy. Now, it's the empathy part that is the most interesting point to Ulmo's character, in that unlike the rest of the Valar and just the peoples of Valinor, Ulmo is in the thick of things. He is in the dirt. He's the one getting his hands dirty, so to speak. He knows what's going on and what's happening, and because of that, he's trying to help out as much as he can. In that, he largely disagrees with a lot of the things and decisions and choices that the rest of the Valar are making. But unlike Morgoth, he's not outright rebelling against Manwë as the authority who's in charge of ultimately deciding on what's what. So he's trying to play within the rules, maybe even bend the rules as much as he possibly can without breaking them. This lends to his empathy in the sense that he knows of the pain and suffering that is happening underneath the Valar's noses. And yes, I know that Manwë and Varda are supposed to see and hear everything when they're together. And yet there's this contrast within the Silmarillion that they don't see and hear everything. There is stuff happening that they are not aware of. And if they are aware of, either they feel it's time yet, or they just don't give a fuck at that point. I honestly don't know which one it is. But having said that, Ulmo's the one who's closest to it. So therefore, he is the one who cares the most about it. He is the unknown and unthanked ambassador of the peoples of Middle-earth during the First Age, in my opinion. In a sense, you could almost consider him the opposite of Mandos, while also being similar to him as well, in that, like Ulmo, Mandos also separated himself from the rest of his kind for long periods of time, and oftentimes had knowledge that, unless he was asked to reveal, the others were not aware of immediately. But unlike Ulmo, Mandos has little to no empathy for anything or anyone, because he is even more devoted to the plans of Ilúvatar than even Ulmo himself, I think. And in that sense, therefore, he lacks empathy. Not because he's evil, because we're not talking like Morgoth levels here, but that he sees the larger plan, or at least a large portion of it. He kind of knows what's going to happen even before it happens. So I think that takes away a lot of his ability to feel compassion and sympathy for other people. And by the way, sympathy and empathy are two separate things. So BTW there. Now, after the First Age is done, I had a hard time finding any other accounts of Ulmo specifically mentioned by name. Obviously, the Second Age happens, and the downfall of Numenor, about midway through, goes down, where all the Valar are said to have laid down their authority, so that would include Ulmo himself, and they get separated from the rest of Middle-earth. And one of my questions always was that, was he still able to cross over into the waterways of Middle-earth after that? Because by that point, Valinor and Middle-earth are in two separate dimensions at that point, because that's how I understand it. And I have heard it said that there are hints of his involvement, such as when in the books, when Boromir dies, that there is a light that he's illuminated by when his body's being carried down to Anduin, and that I heard one commenter say that that most certainly had to be Ulmo honoring him, and I think that's a nice thought. And there's definitely precedence for that. It's just that unfortunately there is nothing outright said that Ulmo did this, like it says in the First Age. And this may be largely due to the fact that the Valar may have been told or just been impressed upon to cut down their interactions with the people of Middle-earth at this point, because they were fucking up, basically. Evil was being allowed to advance, and it was always having to result in the destruction of large portions of the world to resolve that. So it might have been a situation where they were just like, Yeah, maintain watch, but cut down your interactions because you're not getting it right now. I.e., the Istari and the wizards, who they do send over, and that's where they do get it right. But it may be a situation where, from that point on, Ulmo wasn't allowed to give visions to people in Middle-earth through the waterways or try to speak and commune with them, at least not as much as he had before. So, who's to say, really? And if you have any thoughts on that or any references to that, let me know below. I would love to hear that. But otherwise, even though we don't hear a lot about Ulmo after the First Age as an individual person, it is very clear to say that when it comes to wanting someone to have your back and represent you to the powers that be, Ulmo is that guy. Ulmo is the one you want to turn to, push your case before the powers on high and represent you, because he is the one who is basically standing up for you, pleading your case, and trying to get the others involved, while also doing what he can to help you out himself while shit's going down.